But we start tonight with Donald Trump's growing threats against the media and the freedom of the Fourth Estate. Trump talking to reporters today about his latest targets.
I want to expand on the defamation lawsuits. Could you see moving that to other people with individual platforms, social media influencers, people that...
Or newspapers, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I do. I think you have to do it. I'm going to be bringing one against the people in Iowa, their newspaper. We're filing one on 60 Minutes, a big part of CBS News, against Bob Woodward. And we have one, very interestingly, on Pulitzer. We have to straighten out the press.
I mean, I don't blame you if you weren't able to keep track, because in the space of just a few minutes, Trump lobbing threats against the following: the Des Moines Register, 60 Minutes, CBS News, Bob Woodward, and the Pulitzer Prize Committee. Trump's attacks on the media are making headlines and sparking new fears of retribution against journalists trying to hold public figures to account. ABC just settling for millions of dollars a defamation lawsuit brought by Trump. And news outlets are now preparing for unprecedented legal attacks against them in Trump's second term. Top lawyers at Axios reportedly warning that Trump officials will attempt to force reporters to out their sources, will ramp up lawsuits against news organizations for defamation, and could charge journalists with crimes using the Espionage Act. Here's how former Washington Post editor Marty Baron recently outlined the dangers.
He's salivating for the opportunity to prosecute and imprison journalists for leaks of national security information. He'll classify more and scale back things like the Freedom of Information Act. I think he'll put pressure on owners. He will encourage his allies to bring libel suits. He'll try to put pressure on advertisers. They intend to go after the press in every conceivable way.
Trump and his MAGA allies have made it clear what the end goal is: a more obedient and obsequious press.
The media's tamed down a little bit. They're liking us much better now, I think. If they don't, we'll have to just take them on again, and we don't want to do that.
Joining me now is E.J. Dionne, columnist with The Washington Post, and Hugo Lowell, senior political correspondent with The Guardian. My thanks to both of you for getting us started tonight. E.J., I want to start with you. Why? Why obey in advance with someone like Donald Trump?
I think that's the right question. And I think the list of threats that Marty Baron put forward is very important. And I also think it's especially important that large media institutions that can afford to defend all these lawsuits actually not fold before this threat. Because if large institutions start giving in, what's going to happen to the smaller ones? And I think one of the problems of litigation of this sort is that for organizations without much money, this is an enormous barrier to go to reporting. It can put a lot of those places out of business if they decide to fight these lawsuits. And up to now, the courts have been very sympathetic to the idea that the public has a right to know that a free press is enshrined in the Constitution and that they have to have the freedom to report on what's happening in the government. So this is a very, very serious thing that Trump is threatening, just as Marty Baron outlined.
You know, Hugo, the problem for me is it seems as if it's not just obeying in advance, but the problem is also you're almost buying some type of access to Donald Trump. It's if you're not going to play ball, then you're going to be an enemy. And so you either settle a defamation lawsuit the way that ABC did, or you kind of kowtow in advance and you kind of say, you know what, I've done the cost benefit analysis and it makes better sense for me and my financial bottom line to be able to keep a safe distance from you if you're Donald Trump.
Yeah, the ABC settling that defamation suit really was not helpful to anyone in the press, frankly, because that only has emboldened people in Trump world. You know, if you talk to the lawyers this weekend over what happened, they're very, very happy. Like, you know, this is fantastic. You know, this opens up the path for them to sue other news outlets, other individual reporters, and they're absolutely discussing this. I mean, the moment they were done with the ABC suit, the discussion shifted to, ooh, who's next? Maybe it's CBS. We really didn't like that 60 Minutes thing. And then on Sunday night at the New York Young Republican Club Gala, which I attended, the keynote speaker was Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon was talking about it's time to prosecute the news media and people on this network as well. And so what has previously been confined to the ethers of the MAGA universe is now coming out to the fore, and they're feeling emboldened to do it. And I think we should take this extremely seriously because they're saying it out loud now.
EJ, this is nothing new when you look at a history of autocrats. Part of the way that they are effective in being able to control the people is to control the narrative. And I'm not trying to be, kind of casual when I say that the press should keep that line of demarcation, the independence from being able to have to be fearing somebody like Donald Trump. But I also understand that there is a logistical and financial implication that becomes a part of the analysis. But at this point, it's like, why not just say that all independent media doesn't exist really, and that everything ends up being just state propaganda?
At least for now, and I agree with Hugo that they're settling that suit is problematic going forward. But right now, we still have a free press. Right now, we still have institutions that historically have stood up. If you go back to the Pentagon Papers case and the New York Times and the Washington Post standing up to enormous amounts of pressure. Now, you do with media companies have these very complicated set of interests these days that I think makes these issues even more difficult. But your premise is right, that if you can have people in power using whatever tools they have, whether it's defamation suits or other powers the government has, for example, to prosecute on leaks, then you will have a situation where you've got leaders trying to intimidate the press into supporting them, or at least not reporting things that are inconvenient to them. The term that Trump used, straightening them out, put a little chill up on my spine when I heard it at the beginning of the show.
Hugo, former Time magazine editor Rick Stengel wrote that Trump has sued dozens of publications and media outlets in order to intimidate the press into self-censorship, not to actually win any particular case. I mean, I have to ask, do you agree with that concept? Because we all knew the history of how litigious Donald Trump is. A courtroom, a lawsuit, he's no stranger to that. But in this instance, what I found to be very interesting about that quote from Rick is that it's called self-censorship. It's one thing to have to sue or try to prosecute a suit, and then you get a result. It's a whole other thing to bend the knee in advance and to do, as we've been talking about and as Tim Snyder talks about, is obeying in advance.
Look, you're already seeing some of examples in the mainstream media, right? Like, it doesn't come down to individual reporters. I don't see individual reporters on the Trump beat or covering the White House, self-censoring their reporting and pulling punches. But we have seen executives at other, media companies, for instance, the LA Times and elsewhere, kind of wade into what are editorial spheres and try and impart what they think should be the way that the news is being delivered. And sometimes, I mean, if you are a media executive, I can totally understand, where the thinking comes from. For instance, if you have financial interests, if you have M&A activity that you want to be greenlit in the coming admin, I can see why you would maybe not want to upset Trump or get on his bad side in a way that he might, block a deal. And so there is going to be this colossal fight between media executives if they feel like they need to come in and wade in on reporting matters, and individual reporters and editors who I think feel very, very strongly, especially in Washington and on the White House beat in particular, that what they're doing is a public service and that they shouldn't pull punches. But we'll have to see. It's really complicated.
EJ, Hugo just very subtly dropped that M&A language in there, this idea that potential future business dealings like a merger and acquisition could be impacted by whether or not you provide the right kind of coverage, wink, wink, of the current administration. If that's the case, then shouldn't we just dispel with the BS of the idea that this is a, quote, independent fourth estate, if this is a particular outlet or publication, and that you really aren't actually delivering the news, you really are just delivering something that's skewed by what you're fearing is potentially going to happen?
I pray that that never happens, but I think you saw it in the first Trump administration where they were wielding these threats against mergers involving media companies. And I think what it requires, maybe this is very old-fashioned to me, but I think what it requires is if you own a media company, you have to have the guts, the courage, the determination to resist that kind of pressure. Now, I suppose that's easy for me to say. I don't have billions of dollars on the line in any of these deals. But I think that's the responsibility you take in a democratic republic when you own a media institution. And I think a lot of people in the first Trump term did resist that. There was pressure the first time around from Trump in these matters, and the media kept reporting what needed to get reported. And I think we're just going to have to look to people who own these companies to say, if I'm going to be in this business, I'm going to take the responsibilities that are involved in this business, and I'm going to take them seriously.
Well, let me tell you guys, as I say goodbye, there really isn't anybody who's better situated, though, than big companies that have the financial wherewithal to withstand an onslaught when it comes to litigation versus just the average day American citizen. E.J. Dionne and Hugo Lowell, thanks so much for getting us started tonight.